Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer of Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Thank you for joining us for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series. Our goal today, as with all of our Business Over Breakfast webinars, is to provide relevant ideas to help us navigate through the uncertainty of COVID-19 and step up our leadership game. Our hope is that through these webinars, along with some of the other learning initiatives that we offer, that we as leaders can better position ourselves, our teams, our organizations, and our communities to not only survive, but to thrive as we merge into the next normal. And I just want to acknowledge how difficult that has been and is at the moment with kids going back to remote schooling and the pressures of that. Thank you, Lamar Young at Grady High School, for making it a little easier for me. But also the continued violence that fills our news, disrupts and unsettles us. And my thoughts and prayers go out to Jacob Blake and his family. During August, we chose to focus on the theme of leadership communication. We did this for a couple of reasons. As our namesake, Roberto C. Goizueta, former chairman and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, frequently said, communication is the only task a leader cannot delegate. Also, effective communication requires conscious effort at the best of times, and in a remote working environment, it is doubly difficult. This morning's topic is commander's intent, and we're going to change things up a little by having this session be an interview-style conversation. So please let us know in the short survey at the end of the webinar what you think. Joining me today is Ken Keane, Associate Dean for Leadership Development here at Goizueta Business School and retired Lieutenant General from the Army. Actually, I said that the Australian way, Lieutenant General from the Army. During his significant career, Ken has extensive executive leadership roles for conventional and special operations units, as well as in the interagency environment. Ken is an expert in crisis leadership and high-performance teams, and he was literally just on the ground in Haiti when the devastating January 2010 earthquake hit. We're going to hear some of his stories from that time to help illustrate the power of the commander's intent approach, an approach he learned and used throughout his career and now in his teaching at Goizueta Business School. Well, I'm going to ask Ken some questions that I've already prepared. I invite you to post your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen at any time. I'll try and keep an eye out for them so we can get them answered during the conversation, and then we'll also leave a little time at the end as well for other questions. If you would like to become a more effective communicator, we are offering a couple of options for you in October. One is a hands-on two-part workshop on crafting communications for influence and impact. And also there is a dynamic digital program on executive communication and leadership presence. Also, if you want to explore the concepts that Ken talks about today in more detail and in more depth, I invite you to check out our managerial leadership program, and we'll be sure to post the links for all of those offerings in the chat section. So wanted to start with a couple of polls. So the first one, we'll bring that up, is about in what city are you currently located? So you can get there by going to a browser, putting in www.menti.com, and the code is 3401220. So we'll wait until we get, Atlanta, Ackworth. That's happening, Ken.
Yes. Great. It looks like they're all over the United States.
And beyond, I think.
Yes.
Oh.
I saw King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, I think.
Yes. Montreal. Did I see Mexico? Istanbul. We've run this poll a few times. We should go back and check to see whether or not we're people are coming from further afield or not. Well, that's exciting.
Montreal, great. Good to see everybody from all around the world and here in the United States. I see a lot of military cities on there.
So we're now going to run our second poll, which is around, which is ask the question about what level are you, what's your level of your current role in your organization? So we want to be able to sort of see what the spread of roles and positions in an organization are, so that Ken can perhaps tailor his conversation to and his answers to your needs and your interests. So we'll just launch that next one. So 4 choices: senior executive, a mid-level executive, supervisor, frontline leader, and individual contributor, project lead.
That's great. That's very helpful. And it's obviously, by looking at the results that we're seeing here, it's fairly spread out with a little over half at the senior level, mid-level.
So I think that's down. I think we've got about 71% have voted.
Yeah, and as you would expect, it looks like a preponderance at the mid-level, leader, executive level. That's great.
So Ken, let's start off with the obvious question, which is what exactly is commander's intent, and how does that differ from the mission?
Okay, well, thank you. Let me first say good morning to everybody, and thank you to Nicola and the entire executive education for inviting me to be part of the series Business Over Breakfast. And I applaud you for doing this. This is one of the silver linings of the crisis that we currently find ourselves in the pandemic. And maybe the best way to explain is to talk a little bit about how both the mission and commander's intent is applied. And then I'll really relate to a few stories, because I think it's best captured that way. In most simple terms, I believe the mission and the commander's intent, as you've already noted, is about inspiring everyone in your organization by communicating clearly what needs to be done, but more importantly, what success looks like when it's complete. In military terms and definitions, the mission statement includes the 5 W's. The who, what, where, when, and why, which I'm sure is very familiar to all government, corporate, and non-profit organizations. But my experience, what really enables teams and organizations to perform at their very best, especially in a crisis or a chaotic situation, is when the leaders also communicate a very clear commander, or I'm going to use the term leader's intent here purposely so to make it, I think, very applicable and connected to outside the military. But the commander's or the leader's intent, as we use it in the military, has 3 components. First is the purpose or the why. And I would say, you think about this is slightly in a broader purpose than the mission statement that enables subordinate leaders and people to make decisions in your absence. And obviously that's important in everyday work, but it's particularly important when you're in a chaotic or a crisis. The second is key task. And we use the word key purposely so that things that must be accomplished to achieve the mission. Not a long list of things that you'd like to get done, but things that must get done in order to accomplish the mission. And what I often say is, if these things cannot get done, then you will not be successful. Generally, we think of a lot of things we'd like to do in the course of accomplishing something, but this helps you and helps everyone in the organization prioritize, because resources, of course, are always finite. And then the last thing is the end state, or what success looks like. And I found it helpful for the end state to be measurable and, where appropriate, tied to a date in the future. This is where I see most leaders falling short. We do not clearly communicate the end state or what success looks like. Maybe deep down, as we're working through the planning of a mission, we say, I'll know it when I see it. And that generally leads us into mission creep, and we can talk later about that. So let me just maybe relate a few stories on how this has been applied. I think for those who study or enjoy history like I do, one of the best examples of application of leaders' intent are the actions on and following D-Day, which occurred 76 years ago this year, and particularly the Allied parachute assaults and landings on the beaches of Normandy, France, in June 1944. And I had the opportunity to visit there numerous times, to include the 50th anniversary and the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And if you've ever watched the movie The Longest Day, and if you haven't, I'd urge you to do so, because it really illustrates leaders' intent throughout this movie, and particularly the character played by one of the commanders of the 505 Parachute Infantry Regiment. John Wayne plays this character. And of course, there are many other stars in that movie. And he's the commander of an airborne battalion that's doing airborne assaults, whereas paratroopers in the drop in the evening before D-Day were spread across the countryside. And they had to assemble their teams from different organizations on the ground that had never worked together in order to achieve their objectives that day. And they had to make decisions in the absence of their leaders. And they operated on a clear understanding of the leader's intent. They knew the key tasks accomplished, and most importantly, they understood what success looked like for their small unit or organization. As you mentioned, one of my own experiences that comes to mind was following the earthquake in Haiti on January 12, 2010. And as you also said, I was in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, the capital city, when the earthquake occurred. I happened to be sitting with the U.S. ambassador. I had spent the day with him when that 7.0 earthquake struck the capital city, a city of 3 million people in a country of 9 million. I was immediately designated as the commander of the Joint Task Force in Haiti to respond to provide humanitarian assistance. The earthquake killed over 210,000 people and injured another 300,000 in a city of 3 million. And it displaced 1.2 million roughly of those citizens. We deployed this Joint Task Force of over 22,000 servicemen and women immediately to respond to the disaster, to provide humanitarian assistance. So let me just articulate what the commander's intent was. Our purpose was to save lives and mitigate suffering of the Haitian people. It was as simple as that. And that is the same intent that is being carried out today by organizations that are responding on the coast of Louisiana to save lives and mitigate suffering of people. That's the same purpose of many small unit organizations right now. The key task for us in the JTF was to open and operate the international airport. 2 was to provide humanitarian assistance that included potable water, food, and medical treatment. 3 was to keep level because of the devastation of the earthquake. Every street in the capital city was blocked through to collapsed structures. Fourth was to support displaced persons camp, because as I mentioned, over a third of the city were displaced out of the living homes where they're at. And then the last was establish partnerships and coordinate efforts of everything we're doing. I didn't realize that, but that last one became the most important key task. But it wasn't the easiest to focus on. And then the end state that we stated at the time was to transition operations and tasks to Haitian and other government elements in order to ensure a continuity of support and redeploy forces. Our military generally and humanitarian assistance, like the National Guard forces are being deployed, I suspect today and coming days to the current hurricane, is to immediately deploy to save lives, mitigate suffering, but they quickly transition to civilian organization and they redeploy the forces. That was the case for us in the JTF, obviously, but we were overseas. However, in this case, I realized a few weeks into our mission that as I had stated the commander's intent, this wasn't good enough. You know, each day I would leave my headquarters around 9 a.m. after a morning meeting with our staff and getting some updates and meeting with the U.S. ambassador on his priorities and what he was doing. And as you can imagine, we were being bombarded every day by requests for information and what we needed from both Washington and my headquarters in Miami. And all of our units were carrying out the key tasks we'd identified. One day, after about 2 weeks in, I came upon a young airborne engineer lieutenant from the 82nd Airborne Division. He had about 30 men and women who were tasked with clearing rubble off the main road that went from the airport to the center of the city where the most devastation had occurred. And he was hard at work, and as I linked up with him that morning, I asked the lieutenant how he was doing and how things were going. He told me everything was going well. He knew his task and purpose. You know, his task was to clear rubble, and he said, my purpose is to ensure logistical supplies and humanitarian assistance can get from the airport to the center of the city. He knew that very well. And I said, is there anything that you need, any resource you need that, or anything else that we can help you with? And he looked at me and said, you know, I clearly understand what I'm supposed to do and the reason I'm supposed to do it. But what's not clear to me is the end state. Now, in my mind, I was thinking, well, we've articulated that pretty clear. I don't understand what the confusion is. But he went on to say, I've done a reconnaissance of the area in the city, and I've seen that there's the amount of rubble that is in the city. It'll take me 10 years to clear all this rubble. I don't understand what the end state for me and my organization is here. And I was wondering if you could help clarify that. So I thought about that for a few minutes. I said, look, I need to think about that a little bit, and I'll get back with you. And I went back to my headquarters and sat down with my deputy commander and some of my staff, and I said, clearly the way we've articulated the end state of this mission is not connecting from the operational level, my headquarters, all the way down to this young lieutenant. We need to think about this a little bit more. And after some thought, we refined the intent and the end state, and it went from transition services to Haitian and other government elements to establish partnerships in order to transition services to Haitians and other government elements, and then redeploy forces. So we made a small adjustment which captured established partnerships. A few weeks later, I went back to that lieutenant and I asked him how he was doing. He immediately said, we are doing great. If you look around, you'll see Haitian workers with yellow shirts on. I've employed over 300 of them. They are now very much involved in clearing the rubble. They're operating the equipment that we've rented. and I've trained 4 project managers, and I'm getting ready to train a senior project manager. And I think if we can get a little more funding, I'll be ready to redeploy my platoon in 4 weeks. And so I immediately told him money at this point in time wasn't an object. It wasn't an obstacle that we were confronting, because we were getting plenty of support from the U.S. government and others. But he had clearly taken the initiative, and he had established partnerships with community leaders. He had put in using the local community and partner with them, Haitian workers, put them to work, which was obviously very essential to get the Haitians back to work and involved in what we're doing. So that's just an example of, I think, one, how you use the commander's intent, but also just because at your level, whether that's the CEO level or mid-level, doesn't mean that it's clearly understood at every level. And the importance of it is to make sure that it is clear up and down the organization and translated into what they can accomplish.
So Ken, that brings me to another question, which is really around then, what are the elements, the sort of the critical elements that underpin the commander's intent to be successful?
Well, I think there are several of them. First and foremost, I think is the leader has to establish a climate of open communication, a culture where individuals in the organization feel they have we use the term that is coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson, a Harvard professor who writes a lot about teaming and has a great book about psychological safety. And I call it, and I talk with our students a lot about just making sure everybody on your team has a voice and feels that they are empowered to speak up when they're asked a question. Now, the backstory of this young lieutenant was he had just graduated from the United States Military Academy the previous May and gone through schooling. He had arrived at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in the 82nd Airborne Division right before Christmas. This earthquake occurred on January 12th. He hadn't even been issued his unit equipment when his unit was alerted to go, and he basically he joined his platoon and was the platoon leader without having a lot of time in training with that platoon. But he had the courage to ask that question, which was very important for me to hear that question. Now, his commander, captain, was standing off to the side, and obviously that captain had created a climate comfortable enough for that young lieutenant to speak up to a 3-star general in his presence to ask that question. I think the other thing is, empowering folks to leverage the resources they have. They didn't come back and ask a lot of questions after we told them, hey, we want you to establish partnerships, and that's the way you achieve your InState. And as long as you're working within the purpose, which is save lives and mitigate suffering, you don't need to ask any more questions. Just make it happen.
So just another question. You said before that one of the things that trips up leaders is not having tying the end state to a date. So in your Haiti example, you didn't talk about a date, and I'm just curious about, in a state of sort of where it's chaotic, it might be a crisis. How do you establish that date or that sort of end point as clearly as possible?
Well, initially we never actually established an end date in our commander's intent, nor did we put it in any of our plans. We always made it contingent upon we need to partner with people of the things we're doing and transition those. But one of the things that this is a major problem, particularly in humanitarian assistance operations. Once you get involved in them, they're very easy to get involved in. They're very difficult to get out of from a military perspective, because obviously those you're working with on the ground and the ambassador, they want you to stay because you're generally creating a lot of impact. But I immediately started having a discussion with my boss, and 2 weeks after the earthquake, I briefed the Secretary of Defense, along with my boss, obviously, about a transition plan with some definitive dates based upon conditions on the ground that had to be met. So while I was giving them definitive dates based upon our estimate of the situation and what we thought would happen, they were all conditioned on certain things on the ground. And basically, I had laid out a plan for him that we would transition out of Haiti by the end of April, based upon all these conditions. That plan, he approved it, but it did not get immediately approved by the Department of State for a variety of reasons, and the interagency, but it established a discussion and a process between those of us on the ground and the Department of Defense and the Department of State that ultimately led to the Joint Task Force being redeployed by 1 July. So this aspect of defining a date, I think, is based upon where you're at in the organization and keeping that in mind, but it may not be something that you're able or willing to pinpoint at the front end of your mission.
Mm-hmm. So I think you almost touched on something that leads to another question, and that is, what happens if the mission changes or the mission becomes unclear? How do you enact the leaders and the commander's intent at that point?
That's a great question, and this certainly happened to us in Haiti. So in our mission statement, the who was the Joint Task Force, the what was conduct humanitarian assistance, the when was immediately, the where was obviously in Haiti, the why was to mitigate suffering and save lives. We did not put in our mission statement to provide security or do security operations. We purposely did not put that in the mission statement. But this was something that almost immediately came to light, and we were being asked to do by Haitian officials on the ground and by the Department of State, because there was instability in Haiti, but there was a UN military force there of over 3,000 that was charged with providing stability and security. But of course, they had been affected by the earthquake. They lost over 100 people, and both their military and civilian headquarters were destroyed. So their capacity had been limited. But the Department of State really wanted us to provide security operations in the displaced persons camps because there were gangs and others that were essentially creating a lot of insecurity. They were there were some killings going on, but there was more harassment and of females and others in these camps, and it was causing problems. And so we were asked to do a security operation. So my response back to those that I was working with, obviously my boss in Miami, but others, was, this isn't in our mission statement. This is not in our commander's intent. So in my view, it's not something we need to move forces from what we're doing to do it. But if we are tasked to do it, here's the implications of it, and here is where we will have to divert resources unless you send more troops to Haiti at the time. And basically, I said, one, it would change the texture of the mission we're doing, because one of the strong communication messages we were using was our military forces in Haiti are coming to provide humanitarian assistance through the outreach of an open hand, not through the barrel of a gun. And obviously, that was going to change if we started into security operations. And the second one was that we were going to have to move some troops away from providing some of this key tasks that we were doing. And so after a lot of discussion, it was decided that, okay, we will, and my response was, you never give your boss a no without giving them a solution. So my recommendation to him was, hey, let's leverage the United Nations. Let's push the United Nations to get more involved and put more troops into the security operation. And I was working very closely with the commander of the military UN forces on the ground, who I happened to have known 25 years earlier because he was a Brazilian and he was my sponsor when I spent time in Brazil on an exchange program. And so we were good friends. And I said, look, I'm going to ask this and push this. And he said, absolutely, we do need more troops. This is our mission. We should do this. You should not do this. We want to have a clarity of roles. You should remain in it. So we had the support at every level to do that. But we were being asked to do mission creep, as you I'll use that term quite often. And it was occurring at every level of the organization. Troops like this lieutenant, he would be approached by community leaders every day and say, hey, can you take some of your troops over here and clear rubble on this side street because I need to get to my house. And he would have to, and my guidance to him was, you may not want to say no, but you may want to say, let me go back and ask my higher headquarters, because in order to do that, I'll have to move some of my resources off the main avenue over there, and that's going to impact other things. So I need to get more resources to do that. So I'd say you need to keep asking the questions. Is it in line with your InState and your key task that you've been charged to do?
That's really helpful. We do have a couple of questions from our audience, and one relates to, in planning transition, especially with respect to the partner's ongoing sustainability. So I think this is focused on your experience in Haiti. When and how do you think of identifying the role and success in taking over the task, mission, the ongoing business end of the project, leading to ongoing being the operative word? So in planning that transition, how do you think of identifying that role and success and taking over the mission for a partner taking over that mission?
Yeah, so I think it's all about having a robust discussion with your partners, understanding their capabilities and limitations, and making sure that that you're comfortable that when you do transition with them, that they are able to essentially pick up the ball and run with it and not see any drop off in performance. And which is a natural thing to occur as you transition from one organization doing something to another, or one team doing something to another, is to see a drop off in performance, but mitigating that as much as possible. So we established a lot of liaisons between the organizations as we were planning transitions. And then in some cases, we actually left a few people behind as a unit deployed with our partners who were picking these up as connectivity, because a lot of the things that was needed for units that were executing things on the ground may be resources, it may be access to contracting support, because we had limited equipment and other things in Haiti. So we used a lot of civilian contracting of bringing in companies and companies actually from Dominican Republic as well as other places to help those transitions.
Just unmute myself. There are another couple of questions, but I think we can position those more effectively if I ask you a couple that I have on my list, which is, how does this apply to a business or an organization that is not a military organization?
Well, I think it's very applicable. In my own experience over the last 7 years, since I've retired, working at the business school and having the opportunity to talk to a lot of business leaders and actually work with a few of them on projects and looking at their organizations and challenges that they might have. I think the big thing that I would say is, at its most fundamental level, what I'm describing here obviously is that in terms of looking at what success looks like at the end of the operation, is that this doesn't just apply to a CEO. It's a plan of action that enables and empowers everyone in the organization to operate in the absence of orders. But I think quite often a common frustration among small business owners and even big business owners, but I particularly see it with small business owners, is the lack of the execution or implementation of their business strategy and their objectives. Because I think for the most part, we're very good about writing a strategy, laying out objectives that have clearly articulated their vision for the business. But too often, they feel stifled when it comes to seeing their stated business strategy come to life. And most often when I diagnose that and look at it with them, the reason is, while the vision may be clear, the troops, if you will, or those in their organization, whether it's a small business of 15 employees or one with thousands of people, they don't clearly understand the key tasks. You know, they may have a long laundry list of tasks, but we haven't clearly articulated. And this is where I think the leaders have to put their fingerprints on this and put their brain power behind to make sure that they clearly define these are the key tasks in a long laundry list of things I want you to do, but these are the ones that must be done, and therefore you're prioritizing them. That's one. And two is what success looks like. You know, at the end of this, where do I think we will be as an organization? And maybe that's, you know, right now is you think about your strategy and how you're going to get through the current COVID crisis, and wherever your organization is in terms of trying to do that, what does success look like for your team and your company in 1 year? You know, and yes, there's a lot we don't know about what's going to happen, but if you make a few assumptions that, hey, we'll work through this COVID, but in 12 months from now, this is what success looks like for the organization, and this is how I want us to sort of fight through the current challenges we have and get the team moving in that direction. I don't know if that really gets at what you're asking, but it's I think it's something that I would urge business leaders to think about it in that terms. And when I talk to teams, whether it's a MBA team that's just formed, which we obviously have just started up school, and I just talked to a class last night, I said, here's the two questions I ask every team. What does success look like for your team at the end of what you're currently doing? Tell me what success looks like, not in some grandiose ideas, but where do you want to be as a team at the end of the current semester or at the end of the current project you're on? And then what does success look like for each individual member of the team?
That's really helpful, Ken. I'm writing these down. Just give my team a heads up. We might be talking exactly about those things. A couple of other questions from the audience here. And these are a little related. So one is, what would you do if your team wasn't trained in these new functions? And the related one is, my team is very young and green. The top is essentially managing the bottom. And do you have any recommendations for implementing commander's intent with a very green team with limited middle and top managers?
Well, I think commander's intent and leader's intent is critical for any organization, where you're seasoned or you're new. But I would say it's even more important when the members of your team are new to the team or inexperienced and just starting out, because I think they need a little bit more direction and clarity. So first, that would be, I think this becomes even more critical in those particular cases. Clearly in Haiti, we had a large organization. So in responding, the military is not trained for humanitarian assistance operation. That's not one of our core missions. We're trained, obviously, to deploy around the world to fight our nation's wars and be able to deploy quickly to do that. But because they were so well trained in what their core missions were, what I found, the individual commanders were able to pivot very quickly and adapt to the conditions on the ground and the mission that they were given. And I see this all the time. You know, our National Guard military is generally very familiar with humanitarian assistance operations and missions, and are trained and extensively. But our active duty military, this is not one of their core missions, but they're often asked to do it, and they do it very well, obviously. But it does take extra attention by the commanders to ensure that they're clearly communicating. So one of the things I did early on is when every organization started arriving in Haiti, and they started arriving within about 72 hours, I would meet the commander at the airport as he arrived. And I would say, here are the conditions in Haiti. Here's my intent. I want you to save lives, mitigate suffering. I'm sending you to this part of the city because right now this is where I need you and what I need you to be focused on. The security situation, this is not Iraq or Afghanistan, which we were heavily deployed with. And some of these units had just come back from both of those conflicts the month before. And one of them actually was headed in that direction and got diverted to Haiti. I said, the security situation here is different. We're providing humanitarian assistance through the outreach and an open hand, not through the barrel of a gun. So I want you to adjust your rules of engagement and the way we approach the problem here. And I want you to sit down with your troops and make sure they understand the situation. You need to establish partnerships. You need to reach out to the community leaders. You need to listen to them before you jump in and start doing things. So being able to make sure your team, even if they're experienced, but certainly if they're inexperienced, you're clearly communicating with them, and then listen and learn and be willing to obviously apply what you're learning. I'm not sure that gets at all their questions around teams and being able to form them, but obviously making sure that you're getting the right training, the right resources, and where possible. Now, one of the things in Haiti, because we were not the experts on humanitarian assistance, we reached out and partnered with experts, World Food Program, NGOs, and embedded them with them. And I said, these are the experts, listen to them, apply their lessons from doing this in other parts of the world, and take their lead where appropriate.
I think that's great. Thank you, Ken. There are lots of questions coming in, so just want to make sure we get to some of those, more of those. There's one here around, so how does the commander's intent relate to or build on the culture? And I think that builds on what you were saying just before.
Well, I think this is part of the military culture, and I think it needs to be part of the overall organizational culture. Because if this is not connected to the overall culture of the organization, and in the military, above the mission and commander intents, we have what our military teaches today. It's called mission command, and that's from a strategic organizational structure, which is really about centralized planning and decentralized execution, to put it in the simplest of terms. So we teach doctrinally to our leaders in the schools they go to that when you exercise command through mission command, you want to develop plans and orders such that while you're centralizing the planning for something, you want to ensure that you're decentralizing the execution. So mission, the mission and of course commander's intent helps you operationalize this, helps you bring that to life within the organization. So that's, you're trying to build a culture where you're a climate where people feel the freedom to give you feedback. It takes leaders who are willing to listen and to learn and lead from that. So I think it very much needs to be part of the organization, because if you don't have the culture right, then it doesn't matter what strategy you have, it's probably going to fall short of what you want.
Mm-hmm. So some other questions around communications here. So what have you found to be the most effective way of communicating the commander's intent so it resonates to multiple levels within your organization versus stopping one or two levels down? And then there is another question around communication here around, is it helpful to have team members describe what success looks like to them?
Yes.
Way of building that vision more collectively.
So, so let me talk about a few enablers to command, and I'll use the word enablers. I've been out 7 years now, so I've forgot the doctrinal term. But the enablers that I see that we use in the military for commander's intent are very applicable to, obviously, the corporate world too. And the two enablers that immediately come to mind to get at your question, one of them is a back brief process. By back brief, I mean is once you at the organizational level promulgate orders and plans, you ask those leaders who are executing those plans to tell you what they heard you tell them do, give you a back brief. Do they, and obviously you're listening to them to make sure they understand and have translated what you want to be done, and it's a clear understanding. And then they are going to probably come back and say, hey, I think I need these resources to do it. And of course, that may be a discussion on whether you have those resources immediately available to give them. So that's a back brief that occurs in the immediacy of putting out order. Now in Haiti, we didn't have the luxury of spending 2 to 3 weeks of planning it, getting back briefs, and then going to execute it. We were executing it as we were planning it. And so we had units out there just jumping in and doing it, and then we were having to try to put out our commander's intents and our plans and sort of bring people together and say, okay, we need to harness everything you're doing and make sure that we're all headed in the right direction, because we weren't going to stop for a period of time while people were dying literally to do that. So it depends upon your situation on how you are able to apply this. So the back brief in terms of just, and I would go around every day, I said I'd get out of the headquarters. So how you do this in a virtual environment, I think is important today. How are you connecting with the leaders on your team and the individuals to make sure they understand what you've asked them to do, a back brief. And that's applied at the individual level. Every leader all the way down to the individual soldier, there should be somebody asking that soldier, do you know what I've asked you to do? Tell me what I've asked you to do. Do we have a clarity of what we're going to do today? So the back brief process. The other one is the after action review process. So this is for some of our students who've been through an MBA program are all too familiar with this, because this is embedded as part of our culture in our MBA program, is to reflect on what you're doing, to ask, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And what can we learn from this and apply to the future, both the good and the bad, in order to be better tomorrow? So I used to tell people in Haiti every day, today is a bad day in Haiti because people are still suffering and people are still dying, but it's better than yesterday, and tomorrow will be better than today, because we are a learning organization and we're going to get better every day. And the back brief, I have a little acronym that we use. It's I think it was coined by Professor J.B. Kurish when I got here and we started talking about this. He called it the Pearl, and it's the P is what did we plan. The E is what did we execute, which sometimes is different than what you plan. And then the A is and then the R, what were the results? What were the things that worked well? What were the things that didn't go well? And then the L is what did we learn? In the military and other organizations, what I see is that they may have a process like this and use it, but unless then you turn around and say, how are we going to change behavior from what we learned? You can't get better, obviously. So those are the two enablers, I think, that gets at the question in terms of how do you ensure that your commander's intent is being heard and understood, and you're making the appropriate adjustment. You got to have enablers to it, process.
Right. So another question that has come up is, given generational differences between how Gen X, millennials, others like to lead, do you find differences in how leaders' intent is implemented, or does this come down to the typical intergenerational communication skills that we've heard about in other places?
Well, my perception, and I'm no expert on obviously generational differences, but my perception is this generation embraces commander's intent much more so than my generation did when I came up, in the sense that they are eager to be given the why, the task, and the end state, and then you get out of the way and empower them to use their initiative, their innovative ideas, and do it. And they love feedback if it's given in the appropriate, respectful manner that it should be given. And so they want to be listened to. So I think this can be a very powerful thing with the current generation.
Right. I thought you were going to say you texted on your phone. The question came up around how do you manage the organization's hierarchy to ensure teams and people are not overloaded? And I think that's really critical in today's world that we're living in. That each team in the organization has its own needs to maximize and support the company. It's very easy for each level in the organization to add a commander's intent based on what each level needs. And in the end, it can look unclear and overwhelming at the bottom level.
Yeah, so I think this is where I think leaders, particularly at the highest level, needs to be very careful and put a check on their good ideas. And they need to be asking, is this clearly tied to the key tasks that I've asked the organization to do? And if it's not, and it's something so important, then you need to obviously work through that. I tell leaders that, this is one of the more, the biggest problems I think that I personally have is saying no and turning away things. And I think you, as leaders, we need to ask, are you doing what only you can do? Or are you doing things that others in the organization or others on your team should be doing? And if the latter part of that question is, then you're probably over committing yourself, and you're going to get overwhelmed, and that will bring on undue stress in a time that you obviously don't need that. And one way to do it is just look at your current calendar and look through what's on your current calendar and ask the question, do I need to be doing everything I've got on my current calendar, or should I take some of this off and empower others to do it? And then, have you developed a culture in the organization, or is there a culture in the organization where leaders at their level are willing to, if they're not willing to say no, they're at least willing to question, hey, look, if I take this on, this is the impact it's going to have on some of these other things I'm having. Because quite often they'll just take it on, and then you may not realize that you have overloaded somebody in your organization, and it's going to have a detrimental effect in the long term. So it's a very, very tough problem. I think it's exacerbated right now because of the pressures that everyone feels with the current crisis and completely working remotely and the stress that brings on everyone in the organization.
Mm-hmm. So can you have multiple end states based on different time frames, so short term versus long term, or should you really only focus on one?
Well, I like to say you should only have one end state at your level, but that's where the end state for me at the Joint Task Force level was articulated in a little bit different nuance than what it was for that lieutenant at his level. So this is not a cut and paste, from the top to the bottom, but it needs to be nested with one another. If I'm being clear, so the mid-level, they may take the commander's intent from the executive suite and the operational level and say, okay, what is our commander, my leader's intent at my level for my teams? And then they need to take that and translate it at their level. So at that lieutenant's level, his end state was partner with 2 or more community leaders or NGOs to transition rubble clearing. of course, that wasn't what was at my level, but at his level, that's what it was. So I think it's not one commander's intent for an entire organization of 22,000 men and women. Each leader at each level may have a slightly different commander's intent.
So I just want to sort of finish up with a last question, and we do have a few that are still open, but I think this one's relevant to sort of close out with. And then, does it help to have commander's intent formalized and documented on paper or electronically to make it even more official and shareable?
Yes. Yes. In the military, that wasn't the case in the initial days of like the earthquake in Haiti, because as I mentioned, we were thrown into it immediately. But we did formulate, obviously, our plans and our commander's intent within a couple of weeks and put it on paper. And what that forces you to do is defend it essentially at every level. And that's where some of that feedback came in terms of what words you chose purposely so. And I always found going around every day talking to commanders, saying, I would say, okay, what do you think the key tasks are? And they give me their key tasks. And I would think, okay, is that nested with my key tasks at my level? And are we in sync?
So I just want to thank you, Ken. I know you've got a couple of slides to share. This has been very, very insightful.
Well, I just wanted to leave everybody getting to putting things in writing with something tangible you could take back to your organizations. And I have no ownership of these, so use them as they benefit you. But essentially, they outline, I think, pretty much what I was trying to communicate in terms of this is, the sort of in a nutshell, the difference as I see it between mission and commander's intent. And then I've illustrated here a couple. If you put the next one up, that was give you an example, that was the mission statement in Haiti. Who, what, where, when, why. And this was the leader's intent in Haiti. And the last InState was what we wrote initially. And I left it there intentionally because we did change that at my level to reflect established partnerships. And I think, yeah, I got one more here, enablers. We talked about culture a lot, the back brief, and after action review.
So thanks, Ken, and we'll let people have, we'll share those with everybody. So I just want to hand over to the team to close us out.
As we wrap up today's session, we want to thank you, Ken, for sharing his insights and inspiring stories with us today during our Business Over Breakfast webinar. And thank you to our attendees. So many of you have joined us each and every Thursday and have offered great questions and comments. We really do appreciate you taking the time out and spending it with us during Thursday morning. Just to share a couple of things with you before we wrap up. Next Thursday morning, during our Business Over Breakfast series, we continue as we welcome Professor Tom Smith back with an update on Economy and Me. As always, a recording of this session will be available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page. And you can find a link to that page right in the chat. And I'm going to pull up a brief survey. If you all can take 1 or 2 minutes just to fill this survey out, we want to get your feedback on today's session. And again, thank you so much for participating and joining us today.